This is a hearing in the public interest convened by the Yukon Water Board under Section 19(1) of the Waters Act to consider placer mining in wetlands. I would like to acknowledge that the board itself is convened at the Yukon Arts Centre in Whitehorse, which is in the traditional territory of the Kwanlin First Nation and Tanquachan Council. Other participants sit on the traditional territories of First Nations elsewhere. We will begin the hearing with an opening prayer from Claire Van Bibber, so I'd invite Claire to step forward there.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're
So
gonna.
this is the mute unmute button. Okay. Thank you.
Can you hear us? Okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Can you hear us okay? I don't think they could hear us.
We're on mute.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Kahathacho, we give thanks for this day. Thank you so much for coming into each circle that we are having. We thank you so much for all that has been provided for us. Very grateful and honored. We ask that while in our circle with us this day, could you please allow us to keep an open mind and an open heart so that we may discuss the issues that we have on our agenda today. Be with each and every one of us. We ask that you also bless those who are not in our circle. We also ask that the ancestors be with us. Let us remember also that we are having this meeting, we are discussing things for the betterment of our future generations to come. We need to protect all that we have for them. Thank you for those who's traveling. Thank you for their safety. We also ask that you please bless this meeting and bless each and every one of us in our hearts. Masicho kahuthacho.
Thank you. This virtual hearing is being held over Zoom and is also being broadcast to YouTube. Hearing connection and access details are made available on the board's website and on Waterline under file number PM20-018. Before proceeding, I'd like to introduce the Yukon Water Board, who will be hearing the information, as well as Secretariat staff and others. My name is Piers MacDonald. I'm the chair of the Yukon Water Board and will chair the hearing. Sitting with me are board members. They are John Bowen, who is the vice chairperson, Russ Smoller, Susan Hefner, Carl Sidney, Bruce Wormsby, Blanche Warrington, and Sam Wallingham. And joining us virtually is Ann Leckie. We also have with us Mara Pollock, who is the board's legal counsel. And also joining us are Secretariat staff, including Roger Lockwood, who is the director of the Water Board Secretariat, Caleb Light, policy analyst, who is organizing the public hearing, Claudia Wickert, administrative support, who is helping with coordinating the virtual event. We also have consultants to the board, including Steve Morrison of SMR Consulting, who is preparing the What We Heard document following the hearing, and Scott Smith of Eterna Consulting, who is providing technical services and a presentation at this hearing. The sound and audio services for us are being provided by Bill Caron of Omni Productions. The staff here at Yukon Arts Center are also assisting with the facility and technical production for the hearing. Transcripts are being prepared as part of this hearing process by our recorder, Joyce Buckley. I've neglected to mention that our legal counsel is Mara Pollock to my left. I will now introduce those parties who notified the board of their wish to present an oral submission at the hearing. These parties include Ducks Unlimited, Klondike Placer Miners Association, Yukon Conservation Society, Yukon Government, First Nation of Nachonayak Dun, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Trondequashen, Yukon Chamber of Mines, and Liard First Nation, and the Wutougatchin Government. I would also like to acknowledge and recognize many others who are taking the time to view the live broadcast of the proceedings and are taking an interest in the issues before us today. This is the first public interest hearing not concerning a specific license application in over a decade. It is also the first virtual public hearing. All of the oral submissions made to the board are done so using the Zoom platform. Knowing this, the manner in which the board hears information does not change the importance of the information itself. The board is accepting written statements as part of the hearing up to November 19th, 2020 at 4:30 p.m. You will note that this date has been extended by 21 days after the close of the oral component of this hearing. We will be preparing a What We Heard document following the hearing that incorporates what we hear at the hearing and information from written statements submitted to the board. So in terms of general housekeeping matters, as we are engaging over a virtual platform, I would remind everyone of a few important considerations. The board expects that each person providing an oral submission is familiar with the use of virtual meeting technology. This includes a functioning computer, web camera, microphone and speaker or headphones. Please be mindful of remaining on mute until it is your turn to speak at the direction of the chair. Each time you speak, please begin by stating your name and affiliation, if any. Please speak normally and in a manner so we can understand you and the material can be accurately recorded and transcribed. When it is your turn to speak, please make yourself visible to your camera, and if you have one, so the board and others can see you. When it is your turn to present, please be sure you are in an appropriate location with a neutral background, with adequate lighting and free from interruption. Using a headset equipped with a microphone provides everyone with the best experience and reduces feedback noise. Please use one if it is available to you. Secretariat staff and the production team is working in the background throughout the hearing to facilitate transition of speakers and presentations to the board as we've laid out in the agenda for the hearing. Should anyone experience challenges viewing or otherwise participating in the hearing, please be sure to contact Caleb Light at 867-332-0004. If using presentation slides or visual aids, each presenter is expected to share their screen to show these materials. I will ask that presenters have their material ready upon sharing their screen, and I will indicate to each party when it is their turn to present. For parties with multiple presenters that may be sharing their materials from different locations, I will ask that presenters be mindful of ending their shared screen at the conclusion of their presentation. Secretariat staff should have a copy of visual aids and presentation material to make available for viewing if technical difficulties do not allow screen sharing. We may revert to the Secretariat handling visual aids for presenters should this occur. We would like to remind everyone that staff here will do everything they can to ensure a fair and efficient hearing.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, your audio is going in and out and we can't hear what you're saying.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
We'll try our best to do better here. Okay, I'll try to continue here, and if the problems continue, please let me know. Secretary and staff should have a copy of visual aids and presentation materials to make available for viewing if technical difficulties do not allow screen sharing. We may revert to the Secretariat handling visual aids for presenters should this occur. Should a presenter or party have technical difficulties that prevent them from sharing their oral submission, the board is not obligated to stop the proceeding.
Can't hear you.
Okay, we'll try to fix it. Okay. People are working on the technical glitch here, so we'll be with you momentarily. Can I ask if people missed a large portion of what I have said, and do they want me to in order to determine whether or not I should repeat? You can't hear. Okay. Audio is out.
We've missed 50% of what you said.
Okay. Okay. Three minutes. Okay. I'm presuming that we may have fixed this glitch. As I understand it, the Vimeo people connected by Vimeo could hear everything. People connected by Zoom could hear intermittently. Is that correct? Are we fine now? Yes, we're fine. Okay. I will back up a little bit. Sorry. Okay, well, I'll back up a little bit and then continue. This is the first public interest hearing, not concerning a specific license application. Nothing here. Oh. Sorry. We need entertainment, maybe Muzak or something.
Time for a break.
So it looks like we're gonna have a technical delay, and it may take 15 minutes. So I would ask everybody to stand down for a few minutes, please.
no reading materials or nothing to look at. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping we can start again properly. Not knowing precisely what was heard and what was not, I will start again with introductions. And first of all, I'd like to thank Clara for the opening prayer. Starting with introductions, my name is Piers McDonald. I chair the Water Board. Sitting with me are board members. They're John Bowen, the vice chairperson, Russ Smoller, Susan Hefner, Carl Sidney, Bruce Hornsby, Blanche Warrington, and Sam Wallingham. And joining us virtually, can't hear? Not hearing? Steve is saying not hearing.
Now we can.
You can hear now?
You can hear now. You're kind of in and out, Piers. It's inconsistent.
Okay. Okay, this is going to,
So we're able to broadcast out, but we can't have, it's the Zoom not working, so we're going to ask the people that are on the Zoom call.
Okay. Okay, everyone, we're going to give one more attempt to use our Zoom platform before we try alternatives. And I would ask that if you cannot hear me, that you somehow signal that you can't. I'll start with introductions again, but I think at this point, you probably memorized the names of the water board by this point. But I'll give it another shot just so that they get a little more recognition. So I'm Piers McDonald, I chair the water board. With me is John Bowen, who is the vice chairperson of the board. Russ Moeller, Susan Hefner, Carl Sidney, Bruce Warnsby, Blanche Warrington, Sam Wallingham, and virtually Ann Leckie all make up the water board. So it's a full complement of board members are participating in the hearing. We also have with us Mara Pollock, who is the board's legal counsel. We also have joining us Roger Lockwood, who is the director of the water board, Caleb Light, policy analyst, Claudia Wickert, administrative support. And we have consultants of the board as well participating, Steve Morrison of SMR Consulting, and Scott Smith of Eterna Consulting, who will be providing a presentation this morning, hopefully. Sound and audio services are being provided by Bill Caron of Omni Productions, and staff at the Art Center are also assisting. Transcripts are being prepared by Joyce Bockley. Those parties who notified the board of their wish to present an oral submission at the hearing include Ducks Unlimited, Klondike Placer Miners Association, Yukon Conservation Society, Yukon Government, the First Nation of Nacho Dun, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Trondequichin, Yukon Chamber of Mines, Liard First Nation, and the Wuntakachin Government. I'd also like to take the time to acknowledge and recognize the many others who are viewing the live broadcast through whatever platform will end up working. So this is the first public interest hearing not concerning a specific license application in over a decade. It is also the first virtual public hearing. We're using the Zoom platform, as you know. The board is accepting written statements as part of the hearing up to November 19th, 2020 at 4:30. We will be preparing a what we heard document following the hearing that incorporates what we heard at the hearing and any information from written statements submitted to the board after the hearing. In terms of general housekeeping, we're engaging in this virtual platform, and hopefully we'll have the kinks out and we'll be running smoothly, seamlessly before too long. So please keep your mics on mute until it's your turn. Please state your name when you begin speaking and affiliation, if you have any. Speak normally in a manner that we can understand. Please make yourself visible to the camera. Some people in Zoom engagement sometimes wander away from the camera and we end up seeing something at the back of their room. Please bear in mind that you're on camera and we are watching. Please be sure you have a neutral background with adequate lighting and you're free from interruption, and use a headset if you can. Should you have challenges, please signal however you can. If you can't hear me, or if you can't hear a presenter, please either make it known visually or contact Caleb Light at 867-332-0004. If you're using presentation slides or visual aids, each presenter is expected to share their screen to show these materials. I will ask the presenters have their material ready upon sharing their screen, and I'll indicate to each party when it is their turn to present. For parties with multiple presenters, that may be sharing their materials from different locations, I will ask that presenters be mindful of ending their shared screen at the conclusion of their presentation. Secretariat staff should have a copy of visual aids and presentation material to make available for viewing if technical difficulties do not allow screen sharing. We may revert to the Secretariat handling visual aids for presenters should this occur. We would like to remind everyone that the staff here will do everything they can to ensure a fair and efficient hearing. Should a presenter or party have technical difficulties that prevent them from sharing their oral submission, the board is not obligated to stop the proceedings. We will do everything we can to resolve the issues in a timely manner, and in the event the issues are not resolved, the board may make a decision to proceed with the agenda or otherwise modify it. If these proceedings are not available to the public because of our own technical issues, the board will make a decision at such time on how to proceed. So far, so good, I think. People are hearing me, and looks like we'll go along smoothly, hopefully, from here. The court recorder is also preparing a transcript of the proceedings. A copy of the transcript will be uploaded onto Waterline when it is complete so that everyone can see it. I would like to remind everyone to take time to familiarize themselves with the technology if you haven't already done so. We're obviously doing so right now as we speak. The board would like to thank those who participated in the administrative pre-hearing conference, which was held October 13th. I would like to advise everyone participating in the hearing that we will need to be flexible and mindful as we work through the schedule. The latest agenda and schedule for the hearing is dated October 23rd, 2020, and is available on our website as well as on Waterline. Each participant should have a copy of it and be familiar with it. We will endeavor to follow it as closely as possible. We have set aside time for a break in the morning, over lunch, and again in the afternoon. There is a possibility that we'll need to adjourn from time to time or adjust the schedule over the 3 days we have together. If you could maintain a flexible schedule during the course of the hearing, it would be really helpful. We will try our best to stick to the agenda and the schedule. I'll first provide a summary of our process for the public hearing. We will begin with two presentations to set the context for the hearing. The first presentation is from the board's legal counsel, Mara Pollock, on the jurisdiction of the board and the legislative duties conferred to it as it relates to placer mining in Yukon. The purpose of this presentation is to help participants better understand the board's duties and responsibilities under the Yukon First Nation Final Agreements, the Waters Act, and the Placer Mining Act, and the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act. Following that will be a technical presentation from the Yukon Water Board's consultant, Mr. Scott Smith, about wetlands. Mr. Smith's presentation will set the context for wetlands by describing their classification and occurrence in Yukon. It will also tell us why wetlands are important and provide an overview of wetland reclamation principles. This presentation intends to set the stage and provide everyone listening a baseline of information about wetlands in Yukon. We will then start with the schedule of oral submissions. Each of the parties providing oral submissions to the board have time allotted to them in the schedule. Please allow for 10 to 15 minutes at the end of your presentation for board to ask questions. After all the oral submissions, I will give each party an opportunity to provide closing remarks. This is a chance to provide rebuttal or additional comments relevant to what was heard during the hearing. Please keep your closing comments to the allotted time. I will then provide some closing comments after participants' closing remarks. I would ask that all questions and comments come through the chair. If needed, I will interject in order to keep us focused on the issues and keep us moving through the schedule. Depending on how the schedule proceeds, we may need to adjust the time allowed for each of the statements made to the board. So I know I've explained the procedure of the hearing fairly quickly. Our staff is available at any time should you have any further questions about how we're proceeding. Please communicate them with them via email at yukonwaterboard.ca or by phone as I mentioned, 867-332-0004. We have set aside 3 days for the hearing. After today, we will start each day at 8:45 in the morning. We will break partway through the morning, again around noon, and again in the afternoon. Each day will proceed until about 5 or 5:30.
Can't hear you.
So, okay,
Can't hear you.
can't hear me. Okay. Yeah, I thought I was going to get through this.
Hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we have a message up on our screen encouraging people to use Vimeo or YouTube to watch the opening comments and the first presentation while they work on the Zoom connection. So if you could do that simply, easily, that would be probably helpful. Lord. Okay, folks, we're going to continue, hoping that people are connecting via Vimeo or YouTube to watch the opening comments and the first presentation while they work on the Zoom connection. It appears to be a Zoom connection that is our problem, and we need to have it fixed. In any case, in terms of reconnecting, and repeating, I was skill testing question. Who remembers Caleb Light's phone number? I've repeated it so many times. Maybe I'll just begin by talking about the purpose and scope of the hearing. I think we've dealt with the logistics fully enough. So with respect to the the purpose and scope. Those of you who have participated in previous water board hearings will know that this public hearing is an inquiry process. The board uses the inquiry model to obtain, clarify, and gather information to consider when adjudicating applications. The water board fulfills obligations under YESA Chapter 14 of the Yukon First Nation Final Agreements and has a dual role as regulator under the Waters Act and as chief for certain functions respecting Class 4 placer land use operations under the Placer Mining Act. In this dual role, the board receives water license applications for placer mining undertakings and applications for Class 4 mining land use approvals. These applications often consider working in wetland areas. Placer water license applications and approvals account for over 80% of the total applications received by the board on an annual basis. In Yukon right now, there are about 400 active placer there are about 400 active Class 4 placer licenses in Yukon, with just over 300 operators identified on these licenses. These licenses encompass over 143,000 hectares of mine operations. These operations range from small claim groupings to large industrial scale operators. The responsibility for setting Yukon wetland policy and land use policy falls outside the jurisdiction of the board. However, regulating activities in wetlands falls squarely within the board's jurisdiction and objects under the Waters Act. The board also has objects under Chapter 14 of the Yukon First Nation Final Agreements to maintain water in a natural condition while providing for its sustainable use. In order to describe how and why the board arrived at the need for this public hearing, I will take a few minutes to summarize the history of the wetlands issue, including some of the important events and work by the Water Board and others. In 2008, the Yukon State of the Environment report stated, "Wetlands are productive ecosystems that cover only 3% of Yukon's land base, and that wetlands are important for plants, animals, migratory fish, birds, fish, and water quality. Functioning and intact wetland ecosystems maintain water flows, protect areas from floods, purify water, recharge groundwater, and provide habitat for fish and wildlife. Some are culturally important for human communities. Inventory data help planners identify what is happening in wetlands so that they can ensure their ongoing viability." In 2013, YESA evaluation reports began to incorporate recommendations specifically relating to placer mining activities in wetlands which were located in the Indian River watershed. These terms recommended avoidance of undisturbed wetlands in order to avoid significant adverse environmental effects. The board recognizes that the decision body for a project has the authority to vary terms from a YESA evaluation report, and often does. For placer mining projects, many of the recommendations that relate to wetlands are varied. In some cases, the varied terms permit placer mining activities to proceed in undisturbed wetlands, contrary to the evaluation report recommendation to not allow mining to occur in these areas. In 2014, Yukon government acknowledged the Yukon Wetlands Policy Development Initiative in its 5-year water strategy. The placer mining and wetlands issue came to the forefront in 2016 on a Northern Exposure Inc. project when Yukon government filed a court challenge stating that the board had overstepped its authority under YESA by issuing a license and approval contrary to a decision document term. This resulted in a consent order from the Yukon Supreme Court, and the board reversed its decision. In the board's reason for decision for northern exposures, it stated that broader government wetlands policy and best management practices for placer mining in wetlands is currently lacking. The board further stated that if Yukon government develops and approves a wetlands policy or a final land use plan that provides the board with additional guidance regarding wetland disturbance, these documents can then be considered by the board when making decisions. The challenge of regulating activities in wetlands in the absence of a broader policy direction or land use planning, is at the heart of the issue. The Water Board is required to deliberate individual applications on a case-by-case basis, and the end result is a patchwork of activities and requirements. This arrangement makes the balance of development and utilization of wetlands for placer mining with conservation challenging. This is particularly challenging considering that the scope of one placer project next to another differs in their temporal scope, when they have been assessed, and that they are licensed at different times with different evidence. The results of this may be the actions of one placer project having an effect on wetlands within another project's boundaries. Over the last number of years, the board has actively taken steps to become more familiar with wetlands in general, as well as with impacts to wetlands from mining activities in particular. The board has invited individuals from Yukon government, Trondheim, federal government, Ducks Unlimited, the Klondike Placer Mining Association, and the Dawson Regional Planning Commission to make presentations to the board. In 2018, the board began the process of developing wetland information guidelines. The purpose of these guidelines is to provide applicants, interveners, and the public with a better understanding of what information the board requires to assist it in making evidence-based decisions on applications that concern wetlands throughout the Yukon, no matter what the undertaking. In October 2019, the board determined it was in the public interest to hold a public hearing after receiving interventions which requested, among other things, a public hearing in order to consider whether or not wetlands can be further eroded by placer mining, that is, if mining is acceptable in undisturbed wetlands, and if so, what conditions should apply to mining in these wetlands. The board acknowledges that Yukon government completed mapping in the Indian River wetlands in 2018 and in 2020, implemented a interim approach to Class 4 placer projects located in the Indian River area. Yukon government is continuing to develop the Yukon-wide wetlands policy, and in August, the board received draft 6 of the policy and was invited to comment on the draft. Because of the nature and content of this public hearing, the board has reserved its comments, if any, on the draft policy until after the hearing is complete. It is the board's determination that there is a genuine interest and concern about placer mining in wetlands, which requires an examination of both individual and societal interests. This is why we find ourselves here today. This public hearing is not about an individual application, and I would respectfully request that parties refrain from making any reference to individual applications that are currently before the board. Additionally, in scoping the hearing, the board determined that the hearing would not solely be in relation to mining in the Indian River watershed, but rather the hearing concerns the broader issue of placer mining activities occurring in wetlands throughout the Yukon. The purpose of the hearing is to gather information to further develop the board's wetland information guidelines and to hear views about placer mining activities occurring in wetlands. For this hearing, the board is inviting perspectives on 3 central questions in relation to placer mining in wetlands. First, what information should be required to support a water license application related to placer mining activities in wetlands? Second, what should the wetland conservation, development, and utilization objectives be for a watershed, and how can they be balanced on an application-by-application basis? And third, what wetland reclamation objectives should be considered during the water licensing process? I would like to ask and remind all participants to constrain the material and content of their input to the objective and questions the board has put forward. It is also important for everyone to know that when the board members ask questions, the intent is not to be adversarial in any way. The intent of our questions is to solicit information, fill in the gaps, clarify inconsistencies, and assess conflicting opinions. At the end of the hearing, we want to ensure that we have heard all the information we need to move forward in our decision-making as it relates to placer mining and wetlands. So please be understanding as questions are asked. It will help us a lot with the work we need to do, and when asking questions, please keep in mind that the purpose is to obtain information. We ask you to be as cooperative and as forthcoming as you can be in your responses. And finally, I'd ask that everyone be patient during the proceedings and remind everyone to act in a respectful manner, regardless of how a party may feel about a particular issue. There has been no issue raised as to the jurisdiction of this board to sit, and therefore I'm proceeding on the basis that we can conduct this public hearing. And that is the culmination of my opening remarks. And so I would like to turn it over to Mara Pollock to provide the first presentation on the legal framework. So I'll turn it over to Mara, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Piers. As Piers stated, my name is Mara Pollock, and I am legal counsel to the board. This morning, the board has asked me to provide a brief overview of the legal framework within which the Water Board carries out its duties. I have a controller here that's going to help me with this presentation. I hope. I'm already encountering technical difficulties, of course. Can I ask Caleb to come out, please? Thank you, Caleb. So, yes, a brief overview for everybody this morning. As I also hope to point out in this brief presentation, the board carries out its duties within a complex legal framework. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the governing legislation of the board. Piers made touched on in his opening remarks a few of the pieces of legislation that really drive the work that the board is doing on a regular basis. First, of course, are the Yukon First Nation final agreements, chapters 2 and 14, the Waters Act and the regulation, which is, of course, the legislation under which the board is carrying out this particular public hearing, the Placer Mining Act and regulation. The board also has functions underneath the Placer Mining Act, which we will speak about. And finally, the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act, all of which Piers has mentioned this morning. Also to be remembered, I think it's very important to remember that the board, while it is dealing with pieces of legislation, it must follow administrative law principles. It's a quasi-judicial inquisitorial board. It examines applications on a case-by-case basis. It makes evidence-based decisions, and it must follow the rules of procedural fairness. So while these are not set out in any piece of legislation, this is the common law, and it is important for people to remember, ourselves included, that these principles are very important in the way the board actually functions and carries out its duties. I want to make a specific comment about the Placer Mining Act. As people are aware, the board has some responsibilities for Class 4 placer operations. The government of Yukon has transferred authority for certain functions of the chief of placer to the water board. Those particular functions are set out in certain sections of the Placer Mining Act, sections 102, 106, 108, and section 110. Given that, it's important to remember that the board in this context is actually working as a delegate of the Yukon government. So given the responsibilities of the board, you can see that when it's dealing with Class 4 placer operations, the board wears two hats. First, it functions as the water board in relation to water, and second, it's also functioning as the chief of placer land use with respect to the land. So now, a bit about the framework and the processes the board is dealing with. First, of course, we have the step one of the process is the assessment. I have a little bit of a there we go, the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act. So I think it's important for us to remember that YESA is the result of the requirement in Chapter 12 of the Yukon First Nations Final Agreements, Section 12.3.1, that government implement a development assessment process and that the development of that legislation be done in consultation with Yukon First Nations. So YESA, I think, is important to remember for all of us that YESA is not like other federal legislation. It has its origins in Chapter 12 of the final agreements. And step two for the board is the regulation. One, the regulation dealing with water licenses under the Waters Act in Chapter 14 of the final agreements, and two, with Class 4 operating plans under the Placer Mining Act and its regulation. Throughout the regulatory process, of course, the Water Board must follow the rules of administrative law, as I've said, and these rules guide how the board carries out its functions under both statutes. Step one, assessment. I'm going to separate water and land because it is important to remember that the board is carrying out two different functions, and the legislation actually then has different obligations and requirements in respect of those two different functions. So first, with respect to water, under YESA, decision body issues a decision document that allows a project to proceed, which allows then the Yukon Water Board to carry out the licensing process. And if the Water Board issues licenses, it must implement a decision document to the extent of its authority under the Waters Act and Chapter 14. But the Yukon Water Board is not allowed under YESA to give or renew water rights contrary to a decision document or put conditions in a water license that conflict with the decision document. I would also like to note for everyone that Chapter 14 also specifically states that the board shall not set terms and conditions of any license that conflict with the decision document. So you can see that the prohibition is found both in Chapter 14 as well as in YESA, which is not surprising given that YESA's origins are in Chapter 12 of the final agreements. Next slide. Now in relation to land. We continue under the assessment regime under YESA. If a decision body issues a decision document that allows a project to proceed, the Water Board may carry out Class 4 operating plan review. And the Yukon Water Board must implement a decision document to the extent of its authority under the Placer Mining Act. You will note that the provisions in YESA, particular to water rights, are not of concern to the board when it reviews Class 4 placer operating plans when it is acting as the chief of placer land use. Next slide. And needless to say, YESA, if there is, for both water and land, if a decision body issues a decision document that does not allow a project to proceed, the Water Board may not carry out water licensing process or an operating plan review. Next slide. Now, once the assessment process has finished and the board is dealing with its regulating authorities, I will deal with water and land separately to make sure that we are all we don't mix up and we don't intermingle the different functions and responsibilities of the board. So why does the Water Board, what is its purpose under the Waters Act in Chapter 14? So the objectives that are set out in the Waters Act in Chapter 14, as Piers mentioned, under the Waters Act, it's to provide for the optimum benefit from waters in Yukon for all. And also under Chapter 14, it is to maintain water in a natural condition and provide for sustainable use. These purposes and objectives, they guide the board's decision making. Ultimately, the decisions of the board should be made with the attainment of these goals in mind. And I wanted to make a note here, there's a star, that the Water Board is not required to issue a license. Despite, and many of you know, the Water Board, even though a decision document allows a project to proceed, the board maintains its authority to regulate in this area, and therefore the board is not required, simply because a decision document has been issued, to in fact issue a license. Next slide, please. So how does the Water Board do what it does underneath the Waters Act in Chapter 14? The Water Board essentially has a public process. It hears and considers all perspectives. It also considers conservation, development, and the utilization of waters. It considers First Nations rights specifically, and during this process, it asks questions and it seeks information. As a general rule, the Water Board requires, the Waters Act requires the board to notify the public of applications in order for the public to have an opportunity to provide its views. Chapter 14 requires the board to notify First Nations before the board issues a license. The notification is required when water on settlement land may be substantially altered, or when water on traditional territory may be substantially altered so as to adversely affect a traditional use. These notifications allow either the public or First Nations or both to provide input, views, and information to the board. And what is this all for? Why does the board do this? The board ultimately makes decisions on whether or not to issue, amend, renew water licenses. And these licenses are based on evidence. The licenses account for differing perspectives. They respect Indigenous rights, and the board ultimately wants licenses that are enforceable. So before I move to the board's functions related to Class 4 operating plans, I would like to note that the board has functions under the Waters Act that are not directly related to regulating water. In particular, the board may make recommendations to the minister regarding regulations and about reserving land from disposition. So while the majority of the board's work under the Waters Act and Chapter 14 relate to regulating water, the use and the deposit of waste of water, there are other authorities under the Waters Act that do not relate to licensing directly. Next slide. Now to speak a little bit about the Placer Mining Act and the board's authorities there. So what is the board doing in the context of the Placer Mining Act? In respect of Class 4 operating plans, the board is examining, and the purpose, objective of Part 2 of the Act is to ensure development and the viability of a sustainable, competitive, healthy industry that upholds environmental and socioeconomic values and respects Indigenous rights. When the board is reviewing Class 4 operating plans as the chief of Placer Land Use, its work is guided by these objectives. Next slide. How is it doing this work? Like with the Waters Act and with Chapter 14 for water licenses, when it comes to the examination of Class 4 placer operating plans, there is an element of public comment, and there's also a requirement for First Nation consultation. What, in the end, is the board attempting to accomplish? It conducts a review of an operating plan, and if it is to approve that plan, that it does this review, and that plan is based on the evidence that's presented to the board. It accounts for differing perspectives. It's designed to respect Indigenous rights. And once again, the board is attempting to make sure that any conditions and the plan itself is enforceable. Next slide. So in conclusion, the Water Board wears two hats always when it's dealing with Class 4 placer mining operations. One, as an administrative board under the Waters Act and its responsibilities under Chapter 14, and two, as a delegate of Yukon government as the chief of Placer Land Use. It has responsibilities, obligations, and prohibitions under different pieces of legislation, under YESA, the Waters Act, Chapter 14, and the Placer Mining Act. And it is required to follow administrative law principles at all times. I hope I've been able to demonstrate in this brief presentation the extent of the legal considerations, requirements, and obligations that the board navigates on each and every water license application and Class 4 operating plan review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Much appreciated. It's a good summary of the legal context in which we're operating. I'd like to now request that we turn the meeting over to Scott Smith to provide his presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Piers. I'm just going to share my screen here. Are you able to see my presentation?
We can indeed.
Okay, and can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you in the Arts Center.
Okay, I trust others can as well. And first of all, thank you very much, Piers, and to the other members of the Water Board for this opportunity to speak to the hearing this morning. I will go over a general overview of what we understand about wetlands, types, the functions, and their occurrence within the Yukon. A little bit of introduction about who I am. I'm a former Yukon resident, lived in Whitehorse for 15 years. At that time, participated in a number of activities, including middle distance dog racing, and enjoyed my time in Yukon immensely. I'm a soil scientist by training. I study the entire landscape. I'm by no means a wetland specialist, although obviously wetlands are an important part of the overall landscape that I work with. My career has been split between time in Yukon and in British Columbia. Presently live in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. I was transferred from Whitehorse to the Agriculture Canada Research Station in Summerland in 1998. But even while stationed here, I still spent field season time in Yukon most years since then. My work is in soil and in ecological mapping. Interestingly enough, I currently work on water management issues with the Okanagan Basin Water Board, a water board here. It functions differently than the Yukon Water Board, but just to say that I am quite active in terms of water management issues in this part of the world as well. And I was invited by the board to give this presentation essentially as an educational presentation on wetlands, and I hope that there's something in this for everyone. Certainly, as I said, for some people, you will have heard much of this before. For others, perhaps there's something new here. So this is what I'm going to tell you about. This is the outline of the presentation. First section is setting the context. I'll go over the wetland types and the classification system and where wetlands occur in Yukon. The second section will cover off really the whole topic of why are wetlands important, and a little bit on the hydrology of permafrost affected wetlands, as most wetlands in Yukon are permafrost affected. A little bit about the environmental function of wetlands, the biodiversity that we record in wetlands, and I will touch on principle of conservation biology and some of those big overhanging questions that we have in front of us today. The last section will be on reclamation, which includes the issue of inventory. Obviously, we have to know what's out there before we can, before we mine, in order to understand the direction of our reclamation efforts. We want to have those efforts create a variety of wetland conditions that will enhance diversity, and I'll touch on that. And then finally, just talk about the importance of education and awareness, and I guess collaboration in the decision-making process as it applies to water management issues, and finish with a brief summary. So, having that, we'll start with setting the context. Many of you are probably familiar with this. I've read in many of the documents that were given to me to prepare for this presentation. There have been summaries of these done before, but I'll just give you my personal spin on some of these things. First of all, the wetlands are classified based on their hydrologic, their vegetation, and their soil characteristics, and I'll go over each of those for each of the wetland types. A national classification system is used. It was established some 40 years ago, and I guess I'm old enough to remember when that was first established. It's still in use today, and it identifies 5 main classes, and they are listed there on the slide. The same 5-class approach is used in most other jurisdictions in addition to Yukon. British Columbia uses the same set, and you'd see a very similar outline for Alaska as well. Bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, and shallow water. Just want to point out to you that the first 2 are collectively often referred to as peatlands, and these are the 2 wetland types that form peat over time. And peat is nothing more than semi-decomposed organic matter that accumulates on the surface of the wetlands. So you will hear this reference to peatlands from from time to time, and that is referring to bogs and fens. So with that, we'll just run through these five. The first being bogs. The bogs usually contain a stable water table. The water table surface is the surface of the bog is usually fairly dry, raised above the water table. They occur in level or depressional sites, and they always have more than 40 centimeters of poorly decomposed peat that composes their surface, and permafrost is usually within 50 centimeters of the surface. Now, those pictures that are up there sort of illustrate the conditions. I would draw your attention to the photograph on the right-hand side. You know, bogs are often easy to identify based on that sort of orangey color that the sphagnum moss develops. So it's a mossy surface. In some cases, there may be no trees. In other instances, we'll have scattered black spruce, as is shown in that central illustration. So just to summarize bogs, they contain stagnant water with no flow through. Generally speaking, bogs don't have flow through of water. There'll be stagnant water, if any, that's present on the bog. The peat that forms is very acidic, and it's usually lying directly over near surface permafrost. And as a result, the bogs are nutrient poor and they're floristically impoverished. There's not a whole lot of variety of species grow in bogs, other than the sphagnum moss and occasional black spruce. I just throw this in, leather boots will do if you do have to traipse through a bog. Generally speaking, as they say, leather boots will do that for you. Now, in contrast to bogs, the other peatland is the fen. Fens are widespread, as you know, in Yukon, and probably the most common wetland in much of the territory. They differ, they form peat as a bog does, but they differ in that there's a lot more water in the fen. The water table is at or near the surface, and there's usually seepage, water moving through the fen. They occur on lower slopes, and I'll show you some examples of that, or they can occur in level or depressional sites. They also accumulate peat. They may actually, I say they're 20 to 40 centimeters of peat, can often be more than that. And permafrost may or may not be present. There are instances where if you get enough water flowing through the fen, you will depress the permafrost table, and in some cases actually eliminate the near surface permafrost from the fen. They are mostly non-treed. They are sedge dominated rather than moss dominated. And once again, we get black spruce often occurring in and around the fen. So in summary then on the fen, the big difference there, the fens tend to have water with flow through. They're composed of sedges, often shrubby, and as I say, usually, but not absolutely always over permafrost. As such, with this flow through, they're less acidic than bogs, and they tend to be floristically more diverse. And because of that water, you're going to need rubber boots, generally speaking, to traverse the fens. So the fen, although I mentioned to you is the most common, fens and bogs actually on the landscape often occur in complex with each other. And this little sketch here is trying to show you a couple of things about how these two occur together. If you notice the arrow that I just put up on this thing, it's pointing under the fen. That dashed dark line that I hope you can see is the permafrost table as it would occur in one of these bog fen complexes. You know, and it's important to remember that the permafrost table is not a uniform table that exists below the surface, but rather it undulates below the surface. And often in fens, it may be depressed to some extent. The water table, which is that dotted blue line just above it, that could be quite high. So we have this active layer, that thawed portion of the soil that is saturated under the fen. The permafrost table may be at some depth. In contrast, the second arrow is pointing to the bog situation, and in some cases, we would actually get ice lens formation on the landscape that would elevate ever so slightly the land surface. That's what's showing there. You get the permafrost table is higher under the bog because there is less water flowing through it, so less heat moving through it, and the water table sits right on the top of permafrost, and we get that bog in that ever so slightly elevated situation. And this elevation can be just a matter of a few centimeters, or perhaps a few tens of centimeters. So that's the interaction between bogs and fens. So now we'll leave the peatlands, and we're going to go to those wetlands that are also form a group or a family that occur together. And first amongst these are swamps. And the illustration that I have up there right now is the swamp we may have in our minds, the classic subtropical swamp with with crocodiles and highly venomous snakes in it. Of course, that's not the swamp of Yukon. Yukon swamp probably looks more like this: a area that's often periodically flooded, but is treed, which is the definition of a swamp, a treed wetland. But the trees are going to be stunted black spruce primarily, tamarack in some other instances, and occasionally even white spruce. If not treed, as I'm showing there, then the other form of Yukon swamp is a shrubland, tall shrubs, typically willows or river alder. And in that illustration on the right-hand side, I'm not sure if you can make it out, but there's a person actually standing in there, and those shrubs are well above their heads. So we're talking about shrubs that are 6 to 10 to 12 feet tall. That's what defines the Yukon swamp. So in summary for them, the key with the swamp is it's a fluctuating water table that is sometimes close to the surface, and at other times of the year may be quite dry. And as such, they occur along rivers and creeks. The surface is composed usually of well-decomposed humus rather than peat, and this overlies mineral soil. And once again, permafrost may or may not be present. And as I pointed out, the vegetation is a sparse forest or tall shrubs. They have significant water flow through. That's the key there. And composed not of peat, but mainly of mineral soil, often without permafrost. But they're nutrient rich, they're non-acidic, and because sites are seasonally dry, they can support trees and shrubs. I guess depending on the time of year, certainly during high water periods, you'd need tall rubber boots to traverse the swamp. So the cousin of the swamp is the marsh, and the marsh similarly has this condition of a fluctuating water table. Often the water table being right at the surface, and they're located adjacent to small lakes or slow-moving streams. Always located adjacent to some sort of a water body. And the vegetation there is largely aquatic vegetation, meaning vegetation that is adapted to having its roots permanently saturated. Generally few trees or shrubs, but one interesting feature to note on the photograph on the left-hand side of the slide is a marsh, but you'll notice in that marsh a number of snags standing, and we see this a lot. And what's happened there is that probably we've had beavers dam the water body, the flowing water body, raising the water table, and essentially taking what was perhaps a fen or a swamp and basically elevating that water table to the point permanently where those trees die off. And we now classify that as a marsh. And I'll talk a little bit more about wetlands being dynamic ecosystems. They, the way they appear at one time can change over time. They are not a static feature of the landscape. So marshes, they are located adjacent to water bodies with water at the surface most of the year. They're composed mainly of mineral soil. They're usually without permafrost. They are nutrient rich, non-treed, emergent aquatic vegetation, or small shrubs, usually willow. And to traverse the marshes, probably a set of hip waders would be the ticket for you. Last, and some people are surprised that shallow water qualifies as a wetland. By shallow water, the classification system that's used defines the shallow water as a permanent water body, but less than 2 meters deep. So often these things look, they are often small. In some cases, as the illustration on the right shows, they're larger. The classic shallow water wetlands in Yukon occur in large basin settings. The classics being Old Crow Basin or the Welsey Basin, the Sutland Basin, where you have a landscape that is relatively level and these shallow water bodies persist, usually with marshes on their fringes and the fens and bogs occurring elsewhere on the landscape. Shallow water plays a vital role in landscape diversity. Obviously, it provides habitat for waterfowl and other species that will use the shallow water environment for part of their habitat needs. It's also a key component to reclamation efforts, and we'll go into that in a little bit of detail. And I guess unless you're taller than 6 feet tall, you're going to need a boat to get around on the shallow water wetland. So now the way that these this family of wetlands operates, the swamp, the marsh, the shallow water, often occurring together spatially on the landscape, and the sort of defining feature here, as shown on my illustration, is that dashed blue line, which is the high water table, initially beneath the surface. As I mentioned earlier, these don't form peatlands, and they tend to be highly dynamic ecosystems. So that's basically the 5 types of wetlands, their hydrology and soil and vegetation characteristics. A little bit about occurrence of wetlands. This map that you see was first published when this classification system was derived back in the 1980s. And the yellow on the map are areas with less than 5% wetland coverage on the landscape. And you can see that this estimate, and that's all it was back in those days, based on expert opinion, classified the Yukon territory here as predominantly being less than 5% wetlands, with the exception of the Welsey Basin shown here, parts of the Layard Basin, and of course the Old Crow region where wetlands were more extensive. Interesting to note, Piers mentioned, was a 2008 State of Environment report that laid out the number 3% for the extent of wetlands in Yukon. So even these pioneer wetland scientists back in the 80s had it right when they indicated it was less than 5%. Just for information purposes, if you look at this map, you will notice the green areas. The green areas are Canadian landscapes with extensive wetland coverage, And really, the area that is really predominant in this regard is the Hudson's Bay lowlands. And that is a very, very flat-lying area dominated by shallow water and marshes and fen wetlands. So that's really the largest extent in the country. The other area, it would be the Mackenzie Valley. And again, excuse me, a large level landscapes tend to support wetlands. In the mountainous regions of Yukon and British Columbia, we see less extent. Nowadays, though, maps aren't based so much on expert opinion as this one is. They tend to look like this. This is a satellite interpreted map where each pixel is classified as belonging to some sort of vegetation class, and so you get a lot more definition of wetlands. You can see in central Yukon territory here we do show some extent of the bog and fen, and certainly marshy conditions that occur up in the Old Crow areas. So I just want to show you that to say that nowadays, it's largely based on satellite imagery and some sort of predictive system that indicates what we've got there. And we'll actually see some of this work that's been done in the territory. So I said no area value for Yukon, but estimated at less than 5% of the landscape. I guess we do have an estimate 3%, but it's something less than 5. In west central Yukon, which is sort of our area of interest here, total extent of wetlands covers anywhere between 4 and 10% of the landscape. And that is, I'll show you where it tends to be higher and where it tends to be lower. In the Indian River drainage, detailed mapping by McKenna and Bond indicates that 8% of the drainage is currently covered by undisturbed wetlands. Interestingly enough, the total extent of landscape modification due to mining and road building in that drainage is estimated at just under 3%. And the majority of this disturbance is located in valley bottoms where wetlands and riparian phases are located. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. In terms of this idea of how much or how extensive are wetlands, Jeff Bond's work in 2018 used a predictive mapping system, and I just want to show you, if you can, there is this black speckled appearance in this figure that are pixels that have been classified as wetland. And you can see we have a concentration in the Tintina Trench. Again, regionally, a low-lying area, relatively level area. This is where we have wetlands developing extensively. If we compare that to the plateau, the unglaciated plateau area west of Dawson, the landscape that the top of the World Highway traverses, in these dissected plateaus, because of the steep slopes and the rocky upland areas, the percent of wetlands that occur in these landscapes is much, much lower. And then finally, I draw your attention to this yellow area, the yellow line, that is the Indian River drainage and its tributaries. And you can see that the wetlands are concentrated along the valley floors of the major drainage channels. So that's the distribution. Maybe finally, wetland occurrence on the plateau, on the Klondike Plateau. In some instances, we see extensive sloping fen wetlands. And I think the fens are probably by far the dominant wetland type that we have, as shown in that aerial photograph. And on the right-hand side, that sort of purpley looking thing, this is the mapping the detailed mapping by McKenna, showing again purple being the fens, being quite extensive, and she has mapped them extending well up onto the hillsides through small drainage channels and what have you, and then along the main stem of the rivers, we have kind of a variety of swamps and marshes also developing. Now we do have this spatial coincidence of wetlands and placer mining, and on the left-hand side, of course, you can see in this satellite image these very white areas along Indian River, Sulphur, Dominion Creek, Quartz Creek. Those are the tailings ponds that have high reflectance, and we see in these images. And then the bottom right-hand side, McKenna's mapping showing the extent of the wetlands. And I guess this is all kind of nicely summarized visually for us in that photo top right-hand side, where we can see a large valley floor covered with wetland and the placer mining activities, again, coincident with those wetland areas. Now, there's been a lot of focus on Indian River, but I think what we also need to remember is that placer mining in Yukon doesn't just occur in the Klondike, it occurs elsewhere in the territory, and this map shows you some of these major placer mining areas. We have the mining in the Mayo-McQuestion area, which is much of that is a glaciated terrain, so it's quite a different setting. In the Carmacks, west of Carmacks, out in the Dawson Range, the Haines Junction, the Kluane area, this is all glaciated terrain, and the placer settings are different, and we may hear more about that from others who work in that field. And then in the, of course, southern lakes area, we have yet a slightly different set of conditions. And this poses a challenge, I think, to the water board and to everyone, that how we approach this problem, it's not going to be sort of one size fits all. And to illustrate that, and I put up some data that has been generated by Yukon Environment and their ecological classification work over the last 5 years. And I just want to draw your attention to this. This is the number of plant communities identified in 2 different regions of the territory. And on the Klondike Plateau, some 37 different plant communities. 28 of those are in wetlands, in terms of plant communities, and that would probably reflect habitat conditions, than in the wetlands. The bulk of our landscape diversity occurs in the wetlands. Now remember, this is just number of communities, it's not the area or anything like that, but we have this tremendous diversity there. In contrast, in the Southern Lakes area, we sort of see upland communities being as diverse as the wetland communities. In both instances, fens are the dominant community, although swamps tend to be our second most common. So in the Klondike Plateau, there's greater diversity in wetland environments relative to the uplands. And in the Southern Lakes, wetlands and uplands seem to contribute evenly to this landscape diversity. So that's the condition on the landscape. Why are wetlands important? And we'll run through this one. First of all, influence of permafrost. Most research on wetlands has been conducted where there is no permafrost, essentially in more southern portions of the country. So we don't have a wealth of research to draw upon in terms of understanding fully all of the functions of our wetlands. On the Klondike Plateau, permafrost is discontinuous. It's discontinuous actually in much of the territory. And permafrost is an important consideration because it expands the extent of wetland coverage on many landscapes. Permafrost creates an impermeable layer in the soil that restricts drainage. That's why that expands that extent. And the presence of permafrost in wetlands is controlled by the amount of water flowing through the ecosystem, as we pointed out with the various classes of wetlands. So I've borrowed here a figure from Jeff Bond's report, and just to show you sort of the hydrology of these discontinuous permafrost landscapes. Really, we have a predominance of overland flow, and I've got a couple of arrows that are flashing on the screen there. That's water that's flowing immediately below the surface along the top of permafrost. It keeps the rooting zone of that soil saturated for much of the year, and that's where we're getting those big, broad fen developments occurring. It's a result of this water flow. But in addition, and just as important for regional hydrology, is another flow regime which occurs beneath, typically along the bedrock surface, but beneath the surface, and sometimes below the permafrost. And that these waters tend to emanate out into the major river and stream channels on the landscape and feed the hydrologic flow that occurs in those systems. So there's really two considerations here in terms of how hydrology works on these. And this is important when we think about reclamation and the impact of mining on hydrology in these permafrosted environments. So where are they important from the point of view? Environmental functions. Well, we talked about the hydrology. Wetlands tend to control, to a large extent, the hydrology of a watershed. And they do this by storing moisture, because the peats have very high moisture retention capacity. And in that way, they can mitigate flooding during periods of high water flow. They release moisture during drier periods. So this regulation function that they have, and they influence the groundwater, surface water interactions, as I showed you on that previous slide. They tend to act as a natural filter to cleanse water, and in certain parts of the world, they construct wetlands specifically to do this function, but they also do this naturally. They'll trap excess nutrients and neutralize a number of contaminants. This, again, in more industrialized landscapes is a very important function. But on the biotic side, they also provide habitat that's not found elsewhere on the landscape, okay, which can be critically important to many plant and animal species that are obligates, in other words, required to have that wetland environment for their survival. And as such, they provide species and genetic diversity to the landscape. And then finally, we've talked about the hydrologic functions, the biological functions, but one that's very key in today's world. Wetlands play a role in greenhouse gas exchange, and specifically within the carbon cycle. Wetlands, through particularly the peatlands, they store carbon. They take CO2, plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and through the decomposition of their plant parts and their preservation in these wetlands because of the saturated conditions, this is a carbon storage function, sometimes referred to as carbon sequestration. The flip side of it being that if we disturb a peatland, either naturally or through some development activity, we can release carbon as that plant material is decomposed, as it's oxidized, it decomposes, and we can generate carbon dioxide and under some conditions, methane. And so that's an important consideration when thinking about the whole role and function of wetlands in a more global sense, I guess. I do want to talk about natural disturbances, and I made some reference earlier that wetlands aren't static ecosystems, and that there are some natural functions that will disturb wetlands and change their character, change their class, and are just important to keep in mind. Wetland biodiversity is not only a function of topography and water flow, but also a function of some natural disturbances. Some of these things are abiotic, in other words, fire and thermokarst, and some of them are biotic, the semi-aquatic mammal activities, the beavers that I mentioned before. So that at the end of the day, the mosaic of wetland communities are, at least in part, a function of the natural disturbance regime that exists on that landscape. And a number of years ago, was involved in a wetland mapping project in the Whitehorse area, where many of the wetlands occurred along streams and creeks. And I would say that 85 to 90% of those wetlands were all impacted by beaver activity. One time or another, they had been flooded, then they were drained, and often flooded again and drained, and so they evolved under this condition of natural disturbance. So that's just important to remember. So this brings me now, about 40 minutes into the presentation, into kind of the crux of why we're here at this hearing. Evaluation and assessment. There are many well-documented guidelines, documents that lead through the assessment of wetland conditions and functions. These are available in other jurisdictions. They're available at the state and provincial level. They're available at national levels. So I'm not going to go into that, but there's been a ton of effort into documenting guidelines on what and how to assess the ecological functions and values of wetlands. Now, what's our challenge, of course, is that it's very difficult to assign a monetary value to environmental values and functions. There is a whole discipline within economics that tries to do this, try to assign a monetary value to a cubic meter of clean water or a hectare of prime waterfowl habitat, but it's not an easy exercise to do. And this is the challenge for the conservation development utilization framework that Mara described this morning, that the Water Board works under. While we may be able to assign a monetary value or projected value to our development activities, or even to some utilization of a wetland, it's very difficult on the conservation side to do that. So at the end of the day, we don't have a nice equation that we can balance out and determine our direction based on some simple formula of monetary value. On the biological side, this whole idea of conservation biology, and I know there's many people probably listening to this who are even more familiar with conservation biology principles than I am. But we're faced with this question: to what geographic extent should we preserve wetlands? And it's a big question, and unfortunately, there is not a simple answer to it. This question's been addressed in other parts of the world with other activities, where typically forest lands and whatnot, how much forest land to preserve. I'm currently involved right now in a study here in the Okanagan trying to answer, what's the degree of preservation that's needed within community watersheds before we impact the quality of our drinking water. Basically, we do know that in order to preserve the environmental function of wetlands, it is necessary to preserve them to some extent, below some threshold. And this threshold is established through research. And so there isn't a single number that would apply to the entire question. Due to the range in wetland conditions and their extent in the Yukon, this threshold is best determined on a watershed or a sub-watershed basis. So there would be a lot of work needed and to look at this ultimately on the watershed basis, not on a territory-wide basis, not a single value for the territory, but on some sort of watershed or sub-watershed basis. Would be the way to go. All right, so there's no great answer for you, but those are the sort of parameters under which we would need to address this preservation requirement issue. So this now takes me to my final section, and we'll talk a little bit about reclamation. Said I wasn't a wetland specialist. I surely am not a reclamation specialist, and there are those listening to this, watching this presentation who have far more knowledge on this area than I do. But there's a couple of concepts that come out that I think are applicable to our situation here. First and foremost is inventory. Knowing what is there clearly before you can design a reclamation plan, or even a mining plan for that matter, you need to know what is out there. And while some local mapping exists, such as that done by McKenna in the Indian River 2018, there is no comprehensive wetland inventory of the territory. And this would, it seemed to me, to be a first step in moving forward. And it is my understanding in the draft wetland policy by government of Yukon that there is certainly looking at a commitment to undertake this mapping elsewhere in the territory. And I guess it would make sense to perhaps first focus on those placer mining areas that I showed in the figure earlier in my presentation. Now, the inventory activity and the assessment activity, I have put this little cartoon up here just to make the point that I think if I were a proponent of a mining project, this all could feel a bit overwhelming and confusing. And my point here is that the wetland inventory and the assessment of the environmental functions is probably best left to professionals with the required expertise to do this work. So it's certainly a need to engage the professional community in moving ahead. Wetland reclamation, these are standard points you'll see in many documents. Obviously, avoid disturbing wetlands wherever possible, but that's not always possible. Peatlands, the bogs and fens, once disturbed, cannot be reestablished in the short term. All right, so important point. Fens being our most common wetland, probably. You're not going to be able to recreate a fen in the short term. So you will be, in fact, replacing the fen with something else. Where disturbance has occurred, obviously you want to establish the required topography and flow through to promote the natural generation of a mix of upland, marsh, and shallow water vegetation communities. These are the wetland types that you can create through your reclamation activities. And by doing so, you can create a variety of conditions that will in fact enhance biodiversity, because biodiversity is largely a function of landform diversity, a diversity that can be created through post-mining landscape configuration. So we create a variety of wetland conditions to enhance this biodiversity. Use the materials that are available to you. Obviously, soils that are rich in organics, which may include a viable seed bank, is a significant resource in reclamation and should be the preferred capping material to promote regrowth of vegetation. This material can be spread onto your reclaimed landscape in a way that will promote this rapid revegetation. And we do know from our observations, of course, that we do get rapid revegetation, but that revegetation is not going to look exactly like what was there before. And that's just something to consider and to accept. So my summary then, a few points. You know, they say that the principles of giving presentations, you tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So this is the part where I tell you what I told you. There are 5 wetland types, right, that vary in their hydrologic, soil, and vegetation properties. The wetlands are ubiquitous in valley bottoms throughout the territory. The proportion of the wetland that occur can vary, but basically they are found throughout the Yukon in these valley bottom settings. Permafrost both promotes and maintains wetland formation, particularly in the peatlands. Right? They're very important in those peatlands. We would not have the extent of peatlands that we do have if we did not have a permafrost. Wetlands provide several hydrologic functions, water storage, filtering, and buffering. Wetlands provide plant and animal habitat not found elsewhere on the landscape. Very obvious point, but important one to consider. And then my final points here, relative to what we just talked about in the reclamation world: avoid wherever possible the disturbance of wetlands, particularly peatlands, which once disturbed cannot be reestablished over the short term. But where disturbance has occurred, you create a landscape that promotes a range of hydrologic conditions. Typically, these include the types of shallow water, marsh, and later what will evolve into swamp wetlands. Remember, important point, biodiversity is largely a function of landform diversity, and it is this diversity that creates for us the opportunity for successful reclamation efforts. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Scott. Much appreciated. It's a useful primer on the occurrence of wetlands and their characteristics in the Yukon. I'm sure we'll return to many of your thoughts over the course of the next couple of days. The day, of course, we've had a bit of a rough start, but we think we're back on track a bit. So I would propose now that we take a break until 11:20. That's 10 minutes, and then return. We had scheduled 2 30-minute presentations prior to lunchtime, and I think we can still do that. So if we return at 11:20, and then we proceed immediately with the Conservation Society, followed by the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and then take our lunch break. If that would be satisfactory, that is what we can do. So let's take a quick break, and we'll see you at 11:20 Yukon time. Okay, everyone, welcome back, and thank you for hanging in there with us this morning. We've had some good presentations. Now I'd like to turn this over to the next presenter, Yukon Conservation Society. So I'll turn it over to you, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Sebastian Jones. I was born in England, and I was fortunate enough to move to the Introductory territory in 1979 when I was still a teenager. And I'm very grateful to have been able to live and grow here ever since. I turned 22 during a winter I spent caretaking the Indian River hay farm. The Indian River Valley is a very special place to me. It helped form the person I am now. Sadly, the valley is a very different place today. I am here representing the Yukon Conservation Society, where I am the Fish, Wildlife and Habitat Analyst. YCS is one of our oldest environmental organizations, and we pursue ecosystem well-being through the Yukon and beyond, recognizing that human well-being is ultimately dependent on fully functioning and healthy ecosystems. YCS has been engaged with the issues around wetlands in general and wetlands and placer mining for several years. In this presentation, I shall list our concerns and suggestions for a way forward out of this morass, so to speak. Most wetlands around the world are gone, altered, or disturbed. And this is no different in Canada. Most wetlands in the Yukon are still intact, at least they are in places of development. One form of development that usually takes place in wetlands is placer mining. The image in this slide is a placer mine in the Indian River wetlands near the mouth of Quartz Creek. Wetlands in the Yukon have no special status and no protection, despite the valuable role they play. In recent years, bodies such as YCS and First Nations such as Introductory have raised concerns about the wholesale loss of ancient wetlands in the Indian River Valley, one of the largest wetland complexes in Yukon Beringia. The Yukon is currently working on a wetlands policy which will set some boundaries around what activities can take place in wetlands and set aside some wetlands as being of special importance. The Yukon Water Board has made considerable effort towards requiring placer miners to produce work plans for avoiding wetlands or minimizing effects on wetlands. Currently, the Yukon government is assessing wetland reclamation plans unilaterally. YCS is extremely concerned with the current state of affairs, where affected First Nations, mandated boards and committees, and other stakeholders have little to no input to reclamation plans. It must be noted that not only has the Yukon Water Board been declining to approve disturbing Indian River wetlands without a proven reclamation plan, but YESIP has been recommending against further disturbance, degradation, and destruction of these wetlands, as have First Nations and conservation groups such as ourselves and Ducks Unlimited. In fact, the only people who seem to think that mining in the remaining wetlands in the Indian is a good idea are placer miners. YCS is pleased to have this opportunity to suggest items for inclusion in a Yukon Water Board guideline. YCS sincerely hopes that this hearing rapidly expedites the resumption of the proper role of the Yukon Water Board in considering and approving wetlands reclamation plans, There's been efforts to cooperatively arrive at an interim policy to guide placer mining in the Indian River watershed. However, Yukon government delivered an interim policy without the signatures of affected First Nations. YCS and many others have concerns with the YG interim guidelines. It's not a good example of a wetland policy and should not form the basis for a Yukon Water Board set of guidelines. These guidelines have two main goals: to minimize the effects of placer mining in wetland areas and provide more effective licensing of placer mining. YCS believes this policy is designed primarily to facilitate development and does not prioritize wetland conservation, and will thus struggle to minimize wetland impacts, resulting in continued objections and interventions such as we have been seeing from First Nations and conservation groups, ultimately resulting in continued delays and reduced certainty. YCS is particularly concerned that wetlands protection is not addressed holistically. The guidelines assume, without evidence, that up to 60% of a fen can be lost without affecting the remaining portion, and that the water table will not retreat, transforming supposedly protected bogs into uplands. The guidelines appear to assume that impacts to wetlands will stop at the edge of mine cuts. Our colleagues at Ducks Unlimited have observed that the impact on natural open water and marsh wetlands is not adequately addressed. The guidelines do not maximize productive waterfowl habitat. We're concerned that the current guidelines do not consider broader effects on hydrology and do not provide for the maintenance of permafrost or the flow of water over and through adjacent land. YCS has been submitting interventions on water license applications which articulate our concerns with the guidelines. In general, YCS believes that reclamation plans should include three main themes. Reclamation is a significant undertaking, and restoring disturbed wetlands is highly technical and an expensive undertaking. Therefore, it is the opinion of YCS that whenever a wetlands reclamation plan is approved by the Yukon Water Board, the Yukon Water Board should require adequate security to perform the approved reclamation plan should something happen to the proponent. Reclamation should be progressive in nature, and any wetlands permitted to be disturbed must be fully reclaimed before the expiration of the water license. YCS is an advocate for an ecosystem approach where the goal of reclamation plans is the restoration of the original ecosystem rather than the recreation of a particular wetland. The following slides cover the broad strokes of our presentation, the items that YCS considers should be included in a wetlands reclamation plan. Effective, meaningful reclamation requires that we fully understand what existed prior to disturbance. At a minimum, we have to know the nature of and the amount of wetlands. We need to know the exact number of hectares of each wetland type in the licensed area. We need to know how much of each type is undisturbed and how much has already been disturbed. We also need to know the exact amount of each wetland type that will be disturbed. And of course, we shall need to know the exact amount of each wetland type that will remain once mining and reclamation is complete. Most of the wetlands in the Indian River Valley are permafrost wetlands. As the climate heats up, permafrost becomes more and more vulnerable. However, the peatlands of the Indian are well insulated by the accumulation of deep beds of peat moss accumulated over thousands of years. Once this peat is disturbed, it will dry up and oxidize, releasing its stored carbon and contributing to additional global heating. The impermeable permafrost will melt back and in many places vanish, never to return. The water table, kept high by permafrost, will fall, and many wetlands will dry out and become uplands. To properly calculate the climate impact of disturbing wetlands, we need to know several things. We need to know the exact amount of carbon stored in each wetland type in the area. We need to know the rate at which each wetland type in the area uptakes and stores carbon, we need to know the amount of carbon that will be released upon disturbance. And we also need to know how much carbon will be released from nearby wetlands that may be dewatered as a result of changes to hydrology. A well-designed wetland may be able to resume storing carbon, but we do need to know what the carbon sequestration rate will be of any reclaimed wetlands. And while ideally the carbon balance of disturbed wetlands will be restored, we need to know the date when it will be restored. And if the wetlands reclamation plan does not restore the carbon balance, what additional actions might be taken to reduce the climate impact? In addition to details of how much wetland will be disturbed, we need to know how much wetlands the applicant has already disturbed. It's important to know this because the hydrology of the wetlands will be changed, potentially so much that additional wetlands will be lost. We need to know the nature of disturbance of all unmined wetlands and a rationale for why they should be considered previously disturbed, and the nature of the disturbance for all wetlands proposed to be disturbed. We need to know the effects of disturbing wetlands on the hydrology of the area, including the impact on nearby wetlands that may not be inside the perimeter of the application area. We need to know how connectivity between the different wetlands will be maintained, and how will any changes to the water table level, groundwater, or hyporheic flow be restored. And finally, we need a description of anticipated changes to the ability of undisturbed wetlands to filter water, to regulate water flow, to sustain water flow, and sustain water quality. The reason we need reclamation plans is so that the applicant has goals for reclamation and that wetlands will continue to exist on the landscape. This image is of what mining consultants have described as passive reclamation, a euphemism for walking away and letting natural processes reclaim what nature originally created over thousands of years. The reclamation plan must describe in detail how each type of wetland will be reclaimed, including at a minimum to which class each disturbed wetland will be reclaimed, what the water table will be post-reclamation compared to pre-disturbance, changes to biodiversity post-reclamation compared to pre-disturbance, and how these changes will be achieved. We also need to know how will reclaimed wetlands remain reclaimed. In other words, we need to know that after all the work and expense to restore functioning wetlands, that they will not be disturbed again. So, thank you to the Yukon Water Board for hearing us and for acknowledging that wetlands are a really important component of the Yukon's ecological processes, and that we cannot continue to degrade, alter, and destroy the Yukon's wetlands. YCS commends the Yukon Water Board for considering the long-term health of water of wetlands, as well as the short-term economic interests, and for convening this hearing in the public interest. YCS is firmly of the opinion that whenever the light of day is shone onto contentious and complex issues such as this, whenever all the costs and benefits of decisions are laid out plainly for all to consider, the land, the water, and the long-term health of its people's benefit. So thank you very much. And if the board has any questions, I believe we still have some time for that.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And I'll turn it over to board members. Do you have questions that you'd like to pose? Mr. Wornsby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jones, query. You spoke about the baseline and need to look at prior disturbances, and in addition to current disturbances. I'm wondering, when is the appropriate baseline for consideration of disturbances within a wetland complex? And how do we, as an evidence-based board, look at that evidence, properly determine that evidence and determine how we can determine that baseline? What are some of the factors we should use in making that determination to help us get the full understanding of the temporal impacts of disturbances on the wetlands? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, isn't it? In wetlands that are far away from any disturbance, you can just take a snapshot of the current conditions, and that'll form the baseline, and it's pretty straightforward. But in a place such as the Indian River, where there have been decades of exploration before even the mining started, there's a pretty gray and fuzzy line between what is an undisturbed wetland and what is a disturbed wetland. So the short answer to your question would be prior to any disturbance taking place, but we don't have a time machine. We can't go back and look at the conditions from 40 or 50 years ago. It's just not feasible. So the best we can probably do is look at the conditions now. There are places where you can see that there's been exploration taking place and that the wetlands don't look quite the same as they were before. The key, I think, would be, is it still functioning as the class of wetland that it was functioning as beforehand? That's my best answer.
Thank you. Other questions? Maybe I'll ask a quick question here. Given what you understand to be the state of mapping in the Indian River area and the background data that's been collected to date, can you comment on what you think of the adequacy of the current state of mapping and the information currently in place to be able to provide appropriate background?
Sure. I'm aware of 3 different sets of maps of wetlands in the Indian River. There's the predictive mapping that Jeff Bond did that was referred to in Scott Smith's presentation. There's also Karen McKenna's wetland classification map. And the Yukon government has wetlands too on a database. The most accurate one, in my opinion, is Karen McKenna's wetlands mapping.
Okay, thank you. Anne, would you, and Lucky, do you have a question?
I did. Thank you so much for that. Sebastian, can you hear me? We're both on Zoom, I think.
Okay.
Okay. Your comment there about the reclamation plans need to include the 3 things: the financial guarantee, they need to be progressive and completed, and they need to be holistic. And I think I might have missed the definition of holistic. I think I went on to understand that you meant like looking at the climate impacts and the disturbances, but what does holistic mean to you?
One has to be brief in a presentation and can't dive into all of these things as much as one could. By holistic, I mean that you can't plonk a reclamation plan down into the middle of a wetlands complex and expect it to be sufficient in and of itself. It has to be in the context of the surrounding lands. So when a wetland is disturbed and then reclaimed, there will be effects that reverberate beyond the boundaries of the placer claims or beyond the boundaries of the mining cut. And these need to be taken into account. So that's what I mean by holistic. I hope that clarifies things a bit.
It does, thank you. I was just wondering on the, and of course it's something that goes through our minds as well. you have a specific application in, you know, you're looking at that application, but then how do you look at what, I mean, wetlands don't stop at the border of an application, right? So, you know, how then do you create guidelines that take into account the larger context? And I thought for a moment there you might have had a magic bullet.
I will work on it. Okay, how's that?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions? No, well, thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Jones. And we will, next, the next presentation we have lined up is Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and I would ask that if they're ready, that we proceed with that presentation, please.
Great, thank you, and I am ready.
Excellent.
See and hear okay?
We can, yes, the board can, yes.
Great. So my name is Randy Newton, and I'm the Conservation Manager for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I'm joining you this morning from the traditional territory of Kwanlundun First Nation and the Tonquachin Council. First, thank you to everyone who's worked so hard to make this hearing happen, and thank you to the board for the chance to speak today. And I'm sorry, I don't think I have any magic bullets either to offer, but I'm happy to present. So for those who don't know, CPAWS Yukon, we're a conservation organization. We work to protect land, water, wildlife for current and future generations. And we do so by advocacy, engaging in public processes such as this one, and by working with First Nations and all levels of governments, as well as other organizations and citizens. And for my presentation today, I'm also drawing from my personal involvement with drafting Yukon's wetland policy. I started off by attending the Wetland Roundtable meetings that began, I believe, in the spring of 2018, where they gathered up a group of folks to get input on what should go into a plan. And from there, I've volunteered to sit at that smaller drafting team table to draft the policy before it was handed off to Yukon government. And so I'm drawing from seeing that policy evolve and learning from folks around the table, as well as I think having a sense of what issues that policy will help solve and where there's still going to be gaps that organizations like the Water Board can help fill in. So CPAWS Yukon, we don't typically intervene on individual water license applications. There's just simply too many for us to keep up with. But we felt it was important to present today for exactly the same reason. There's too many water license applications for us to keep up with, and I'm sure other groups find the same. But it's the sum of these individual decisions and projects that leads to wetland disturbance and transformation, really at a landscape scale. So the most obvious example, of course, is the Indian River watershed. That's where this photo is from and where all of my photos are from. Of course, I realize this is not limited to the Indian River watershed, this hearing. But I think it's notable that 100% of the unmined wetlands in this watershed are covered by claims. Many of these peatlands will be converted to that shallow open water marshes or even dryland habitat that you can see on my screen. And even with reclamation, even if not all of those unmined wetlands are mined, we're still changing the function of these landscapes at a large scale and leaving a checkerboard of disturbance across this landscape and changing how it functions in terms of water movement and storage, carbon storage, biodiversity, and of course, cultural values and how people use and relate to that landscape. And I think most concerning to us is we're undertaking that transformation without a baseline understanding of to know what we're changing. We're often lacking historical context to frame decisions by what's already been lost and changed, and without understanding the thresholds of acceptable change. I think it's quite striking to see where our current policy framework of approving development project by project has led us. without the guidance of a land use plan. You can compare what the Indian River watershed looked like in the 1980s. Now there's still disturbance. This is the oldest imagery I could find, but you can still see these curves of the river. You can compare that to what the watershed looks like now. You see this pattern of change and disturbance that's spread across the landscape following those curves of the river. I think development at this scale is really de facto land use planning. And, in this place, it's made it difficult to consider any other kind of future for this watershed, even now that there's planning underway in the Dawson region. And so my hope for this hearing is that it's a step towards building a policy and management framework where we can consider cumulative effects and a diverse set of values, honor the final agreement's Aboriginal rights, and sort of cement taking a precautionary approach so we don't end up with this level of development before we've had a chance to establish thresholds of change that we can all agree on. And in saying that, I do recognize that the Water Board and YESA have tried to take a precautionary approach to development in wetlands and by not permitting development in the Indian River watershed in those unmined wetlands. Now I'm going to hone in on those 3 questions the board has asked us to consider and address. I decided to start with that second question, which is at a watershed scale, what should the wetland conservation, development, and use objectives be for wetlands, and how can they be balanced on an application by application basis? And I can see how that's a tough question for the board. The board is tasked with making decisions that provide optimum benefit. And I think deciding what's optimum, it strikes me as a question that comes down to values. You need to think long-term, large scale. Ideally, you have access to really good baseline information. You can do scenario modeling. And often that's where land use planning has stepped in to address these issues, with the resulting land use plan providing a framework to make those decisions on that application by application basis. Given that many of the board's decisions are going to be made ahead of land use planning, without that guiding land use plan in place, I suggest it makes sense for these conservation, development, and use objectives to align with the broader goals of land use planning, anticipating that eventually there will be land use planning. Because if these objectives don't align with land use planning, I think ultimately it can erode the potential and the promise of that process. And so at a high level, I suggest looking at Chapter 11 of the Umbrella Final Agreement for some guidance for this question. That chapter lays out one of the goals of land use planning is to enable sustainable development. And I think that's often a buzzword, definitely. But the UFA has a helpful definition of beneficial change that doesn't undermine ecological and social systems that communities and societies depend on. Of course, recognize the UFA doesn't apply across the territory or to First Nations without final agreements, but I think this principle of aligning with the broader goals of land use planning still holds. And in terms of what this translates into, in terms of the objectives the board is looking at, I believe is no net loss of wetland benefits, meaning development could go ahead when it won't negatively impact wetland benefits, including ecological function, as well as sociocultural values, and that any benefits that are lost can be restored. CPAW's Yukon, we've also recommended this approach for the Yukon wetland policy. To make this kind of assessment, if a project aligns with the no net loss goal, the board, of course, needs the right kind of information, the ability to evaluate and predict cumulative effects on a diverse set of values, and the ability to predict reclamation outcomes. If this information isn't available, I think the board needs the ability to pause decisions on mining and undisturbed wetlands until it can get that information, or until a management framework is in place that's provided through land use planning or deep consultation. If I'm understanding this correctly, that's outside the immediate authority of the board, but could be enabled through Section 32 of the Waters Act. And perhaps this could also be place to establish those thresholds that Scott Smith spoke to earlier, and to make the time to ensure we have the proper wetland inventory in place. And I think this type of process is even more critical if we're considering objectives that permit some loss of benefits, to making sure, so we make sure we're not crossing those ecological or cultural thresholds. And then moving on to the next question, which is actually question number 1. What information should be required to support a license application? I'm not going to spend too much time on what exactly that information should be. Sebastian provided a really great comprehensive list, and I suspect we'll hear other lists during this hearing. But I did want to speak to a few points. I mean, the first being wetlands are complex systems, and you need comprehensive baseline information to capture that complexity and make good decisions. Wetlands are connected to each other by water flows above and below ground. They're connected to land and biological systems. They're grounded in their regional context. Again, like Scott spoke to, the difference between Klondike Plateau and Southern Lakes wetlands. And they're also intertwined with social and cultural values. And I was reminded of this at one of the early wetland roundtable meetings. We were speaking of the need for a wetland inventory, or debating about the need for a wetland inventory and what should be included in it. And a lot of people spoke to, hectares on the ground and types of wetlands and amount of carbon. And an elder stood and said, if you're doing an inventory, you need to make sure that you're mapping the historical travel routes and trails that First Nations people have used because they're so connected to wetlands. And that was a reminder for me of, right, that is just as important as, how many hectares of fens or marshes we have on the ground. And of course, that's difficult information to capture at the scale of a project, or even impossible information to collect at the scale of a project. And so I have read through the draft information guidelines that the board has drafted, and that I understand are intended to guide applicants in the information they are meant to submit. And in places I did notice, I guess what I would call maybe a disjoint between the intent to gather really important information and the method to try and collect it. I guess as one example, the one section where I felt this was particularly true was looking at 2.1, where the applicant is meant to provide information on traditional use and knowledge, things like spiritual aspects of the area and mental well-being from being out on the land. And obviously this is incredibly critical information to be considered, but I think challenging for an applicant to provide, perhaps not appropriate for an applicant to provide. And not to say that this is something to be skipped over, because incredibly important to integrate. And so I think what this points to is that some information is best gathered and considered through a comprehensive evaluation and planning process undertaken with First Nations. Again, if my understanding is correct, I believe under the Waters Act, the Commissioner and Executive Council can enable the Water Board to pause license permitting when this process needs to be carried out. And again, I've mentioned section 2.1, but I'm sure the same holds for getting a proper inventory of wetlands and making those decisions at a watershed scale. And on to the final question, reclamation objectives to be considered. So earlier I'd recommended that the Water Board adopt a no net loss of wetland benefits to evaluate projects. And so the same objective would hold true for reclamation. And when I say restoring lost wetland benefits, I don't necessarily mean restoring a wetland to its original condition, which is often impossible to do, particularly if it's a peatland. I mean, reclaim the land in a way that brings back benefits lost. And a large part of doing that is avoiding or minimizing the loss of these benefits in the first place. In cases where we predict it's not going to be possible to restore benefits in any reasonable time frame, then wetland disturbance should either be avoided unless there's a management framework like an agreed to land use plan or a threshold that says otherwise. And it seems that some watersheds, such as the Indian River watershed, have already approached that threshold of acceptability. There also need to be clear targets or endpoints for reclamation, so we can actually deem a site reclaimed. And of course, reclamation comes with risk. It might not lead to predicted outcomes. I believe Jamie from Ducks Unlimited later on is going to speak about some emerging reclamation techniques, but they're emerging, so they come with a high level of risk. Reclamation is also risky because there's a disjoint in responsibility. The cumulative effects and time frame needed to monitor success of reclamation extend well beyond the typical project time frame. And so I suggest to combat this, we need to develop a comprehensive inventory, monitoring program and clearly establish responsibilities for reclamation and monitoring. I think this is needed to help evaluate change, evaluate the effectiveness of mitigations and reclamation at both the project scale and the watershed scale. I recognize parts of this recommendation might extend beyond the immediate authority of the board, but I mention it because it's such a critical piece for supporting learning and informed decision-making by the board, and also to hold people and organizations accountable to the objectives and goals that will come out of this hearing and the wetland policy. And it's really the only way we can answer these key questions that we need answers to. How have we changed the landscape and wetlands? Were the mitigations and license terms, did they work as we thought they would? Did they have to be adjusted? Did reclamation work as we thought it would? And have we maintained or restored the values that we thought we would and that were our goal to maintain? I suggest as part of this also ensuring there's clear responsibility for monitoring and reporting at a project scale and a watershed scale, with responsibility at a project scale falling to the proponent as one suggestion, not that it could not be undertaken by a wetland professional, and responsibility at a watershed scale falling to the government to capture those watershed scale effects. And to establish clear responsibility for reclamation success. It seems like this hearing and also the wetland policy is going to point to higher standards for reclamation. And since reclamation's success, we won't know it until many years in the future. Ensuring this line of responsibility, I suggest, could be accomplished either through financial security or perhaps something like a reclamation fee, where a proponent pays the government a certain amount of money per hectare and responsibility for reclamation falls to the government. And then small but important pieces, a plan in place if mitigations or reclamations don't work as expected, and publicly reporting on impacts and reclamation success. So thank you to the Water Board for convening this hearing. I do hope it leads to policy change because the status quo has led to a landscape scale. In many cases, and I'd say where we are with the Indian River, we're nearing or past thresholds of environmental change. And as I was making this slide, I just randomly threw this photo on, but that it kind of struck me as a photo where we have already reached that threshold, looking at that milky color of the Indian River, and comparing that to stories from elders who speak of a clear river that once bore salmon. And so I believe we can avoid situations like this through that no net loss approach that I spoke of. I mean, if we choose to deviate from that approach, making sure we're doing so with good information and having it framed by land use planning or deep consultation. And I sincerely believe we can write a different story for wetlands in the territory and that we can do things differently. We just have to do things differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. Questions from the board, please. Mr. Worsby.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Newton. Just a query. When I was listening to you speak, you were speaking a lot of this extension of authority by the commissioner and council, and obviously, as you'll be aware, that's not necessarily an authority that will be a guarantee for the boards. So I would perhaps just like to ask you if that isn't a forthcoming option. How can the board better evaluate case by case basis on single applications, considering a holistic view of the watershed if that authority you referenced is not necessarily forthcoming to the board? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, in this presentation, I think I chose to present what would be the optimal option where the board has the best information to make these types of decisions. Understanding that that may not happen, I think the board is going to have to determine if it has enough information to issue water licenses for placer mining activity in unmined wetlands. I do think out of this hearing, the information presented will help to improve the guidelines that the board has drafted and lead to better consideration of applications on a case-by-case basis. But ultimately, I think if the board is trying to make optimal decisions, that's difficult to do without having a good understanding of the values that are going to be impacted.
Thank you. Other questions from the board? No? Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Newton, and that brings us to our noontime, and we are almost unbelievably right on schedule. So thank you, and I will ask, as per our draft agenda, that we break until 1:30 Yukon time, at which time we will hear from the government of Yukon. So we'll see everybody at 1:30. Thank you.